Plainfield Town Hall residents, most of the people that are here are from boards and commissions. We have people, I think, from out of town. Yep. But that's great, because this is supposed to be for public information, and that's what the Freedom of Information Act is. And I wanted to introduce Russell. Russell, if you wouldn't mind. We have some residents who are interested in learning a little bit more about FOI, what it means, what it does as a town. As a town, we normally get in requests for freedom of information that talks about, hey, can you give us this type of information? And it's kind of simple. I can give a real brief of what we do. What we do is we try to accept the information from whomever may have sent it to us, do a quick reply to them as soon as possible. We usually give 4 business days to reply back. So we like to get that letter right back out to them, whether it's email, whether it's phone call, to get more information. Sometimes it's a very vague request, so you'd like to make sure you get the right information to them that they're looking for. And so then it depends on the actual amount of data that's being asked. Sometimes we get something that's very quick, we can turn it around within a day. Sometimes it's based on what they're asking for. Hey, can I get the historical data that's in the town vault that's been there since 1998? So it gives us a little chance to go and take a look in depth as to what they're looking for. I've had one which is about 1,000 pages sitting in my office right now. That was never picked up. But it's important for us to know what is and what isn't. One of the other highlights I would say is we've talked about this before. We've had some video on this before. Some questions have come up about, can I communicate to my other board members? How do I do that?
Sure.
So I think these are some of the things we'd all like to hear, and I appreciate your time in coming out, and thank you very much. And again, thank you, Russell.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. My name is Russell Blair. I'm the Director of Education and Communications at the Freedom of Information Commission. And before I did this, I was a journalist for about a dozen years, so I know town government from that perspective. I know FOI from that perspective. But I've been at the Commission coming up on a year, and I run all of our training programs. I go to towns across the state and do these presentations, do them for state agencies. I also I go to all our commission meetings. I talk very closely with all the attorneys that we work with. I have a good understanding of the Freedom of Information Act. One thing I always like to say when I do these presentations is I'm not actually an attorney. A lot of people think I am. But I make that point because I know most of you are not attorneys, and it's challenging if you're on a board or commission. You work for the town, you get an FOI request, you have questions about meetings, we'll talk about the meetings parts of the law too. And you're kind of in this position where you're like, gee, I didn't sign up for this, right? Somebody asked me to run for planning and zoning or in the wetlands or whatever it may be, and maybe you know about land use, or maybe you're on the Economic Development Commission because you know about business, and then all of a sudden there's all these other things you have to learn about too, Robert's Rules and FOI. And I say that to make it, the point that you're not going to leave here an expert tonight, but we hope you get, enough information. So when you're in those positions, when you have to make a decision, when you're thinking, gee, does this agenda look right? When do I need to file the minutes? I got an FOI request, what do I do? That you have, the basic tools that you need. So you can, it doesn't become this scary thing that you don't know what to do. Oh my gosh, it's FOI. You know what you need to do. You know what you need to do it effectively. Because the other thing that I always like to point out is, so I work at the FOI Commission. If you don't know about the FOI Act in Connecticut, the way everything works is for us to get involved in anything, it comes in the form of a complaint. So if somebody is denied access to a public meeting, if somebody thinks that your agenda isn't proper, if somebody thinks that the minutes, they can't find the minutes weren't filed on time, or they make a records request and they don't get the records that they're looking for, or they think that your agency's taking too long to produce the records. Anytime anyone's rights are violated under FOI, they file a complaint with us. We're sort of like the state police, but only for FOI. The only thing our agency does is enforce FOI. We get about 600 to 700 complaints a year, and that's all we do is we deal with those complaints. So what we're doing today is trying to give you the education, give you the tools, so that you know what to do, so that you don't get a complaint filed against you because you know what you need to do and you did it right. And as was said, you also know what you don't need to do. That's part of what we'll cover too, is what are the things that you don't need to do under FOI. People think sometimes that you're going to do everything for them, you're going to do all the work for them, and that's not really what FOI is about. I like to say, again, we're trying to avoid complaints. I did a training session last year, and a complaint was filed the next day, so I hope we avoid that here tonight. For starters, I think it's important to know, kind of the basic two parts of FOI. And again, it's about public access to meetings and it's about public access to records. If you didn't know, FOI, the law, goes back to 1975, so coming up on almost 50 years of this being the law. If you think back to what was going on in the early 1970s, this was a post-Watergate reform. People were really concerned about government operating in secrecy. So basically, the law says, your meetings, when you're doing your work on your boards and commissions, the public needs to be able to see what you're doing, to be able to sit in the meetings, watch, observe. And then they also need to have access to the records of the town and the boards and commissions. What are you using to make those decisions? When you're setting the budget, what are you looking at? What reports are you getting from the town? What information are you getting about staffing, budgets, those types of things? How are members communicating back and forth? Somebody can FOI communications between board members or between board members and town staff. They want to find out, what were they talking about when they were making those decisions. FOI, it's really an access law. It's about access to information. We'll talk about meetings first, and one of the important things that is important to know about meetings is it's really, again, it's about access to meetings. Very frequent question I get is about, and let me just say too, because I can see everyone here, if you have a question, just throw your hand up, because I find it's easier to do it while we're talking, so if I mention something and you want to get into it more, just throw your hand up. So with meetings, it's about access. There's no law in Connecticut that requires you to have public comment at your meetings. If you do, that's great. I think it's important, especially in smaller towns. People want to be able to talk to their elected representatives. It's a good thing to have that for constituents. But a couple things, you don't need to have it under freedom of information. And if you do have it, you're in charge of how you want to do it. You can have limitations on topics. People can only address items on the agenda. You can do a time limit. It's only 3 minutes. It's 5 minutes. You could say it's only people who live in town. You could say we're only going to do it every other meeting. Whatever you want to do with public comment, you're not infringing on anyone's rights under FOI in terms of public comment. Their right is to attend the meeting. You can't, kick someone out of the meeting because they're not from town, but if you wanted to say, look, public comment is only for, residents and taxpayers, you could do something like that. Again, it's about access. It's about allowing people to come to your meetings, to sit there and observe. But if they participate, if you have a public audience, that's entirely within your control. One important thing about boards and commissions in particular, and this goes for meetings and also for, for agendas and minutes and things like that, if you create a subcommittee, whenever a board makes a subcommittee, that is basically a new public agency under FOI. So if you're on a board and you create a subcommittee, you pick members and you put them on and you give them a task and they do meetings. You still need to do, talk through all the requirements of the meetings, but that's basically a new public entity. You still need to follow all the rules of FOI. The way to think of it is you can't delegate away your FOI obligations. So if your board is covered, if your office is covered, if you work for the town, if you're covered by FOI, you can't create a new entity and then say, well, they're going to go off and do this and we don't need to worry about FOI because it's not our board. It's, it's only 3 members of the board or something like that. We'll get in more specifics about meetings and quorums and things like that in a second, but if you create a subcommittee, just know it's a new board. You need to do all the things that we're going to talk about next with meetings. So, what is a public meeting under FOI? It's actually pretty specific. So there's a few things I like to read from the definition, not to bore you, but because there's a few things that I think are always good to highlight. So in the FOI Act, a meeting is any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. So again, it's a mouthful, but there's a few things in there I want to point out. So we heard quorum a couple times there. Everyone know what a quorum is? It's the majority of your board. So if you have a 9-member board, 5 people is your quorum. If you have a 3-member board, and this is the challenge in smaller towns, if you have a 3-member board of selectmen, 2 members is the quorum. It's a voting majority of the board, enough people to make a decision on behalf of the board. And then there's also a part in there that a meeting can be in person or by means of electronic equipment. So when you put those two together, really what a meeting is under FOI is any time you have a quorum of your board either discussing or taking action on anything that's within that board's purview. To your point about communication, so that can include emails, that can include text messages. A meeting does not, by statute, necessarily have to be in person. I get a lot of questions about emails and boards and commissions, so I'll give you some guidance. And then if you have questions about it, particular things that come up, we can address that. Just sending an email to your whole board or commission is not an illegal meeting. Sometimes people think, oh, we can't have everyone on the email. Oh no, someone sent an email to everybody. Oh my gosh, it's an illegal meeting. What makes it an illegal meeting under FOI is if people start a discussion or they take action. So if one board member wants to share a proposal, you're on planning and zoning, and maybe you have an idea about where in town would be a good location for affordable housing. I know that's a big thing that's going on right now. Maybe you have an idea you want to share. You could share a proposal with your board members in an email as long as you say, hey, let's talk about this at the next meeting. That's kind of always what you should be thinking about is you can share information. It could be a proposal. It could be something you want to add to the agenda. Hi, I'd like us to put this topic on the agenda. Somebody ran into me at the supermarket and they asked about it, and I think this is an issue we need to address. It could be sharing a newspaper article or something that you found out about what your town is doing or another town is doing. Anything that you want to share, as kind of an FYI is okay, but you don't want to start the discussion over the email or over the text message. You want to save your discussion, for the next meeting. Certainly you can't vote over, emails or text. At their next meeting, they'll say, well, as we decided over email, you never want to do that. You can't be making decisions, over an email. A couple things there. One, you could run into an FOI violation. If someone learned of that, they could say, look, the Planning and Zoning Commission was talking about this project on an email. It wasn't at the meeting. They could file a complaint. And then the next part is that those emails are public records. So somebody could come along and request those emails. So in addition to potentially facing a complaint about the fact that you guys are meeting outside of a properly scheduled meeting, somebody could also get access to the information that you may have thought was confidential. Gee, we were just talking over email before the meeting. They're not going to know what we're talking about. It's a private conversation among the board members. But if it's about board business, those are public records. And that's kind of the last key thing about there to take into consideration is it does have to be related to the work that you do on your board or commission. So if you're emailing, your board about, hey, where do you guys think is the best pizza in town or something like that, hey, I hope to see you all at the fair, things like that. If it's not board business, it's not a meeting. But if it's a quorum of your board together, no matter the setting, and email, text message, the coffee shop, anything like that, if you're talking about what your board needs to do, those are meetings under FOI, and you run the risk of somebody filing a complaint if they were to learn about that. Anyone have any questions on that point on emails? And yes.
So as far as text messaging goes, so you send out a message to your group, and so you, like you said, you give out your information. Hey, I have this idea. Do you have to say in that text message every time, do not respond to this?
I've seen some people do that where they say, like, please don't reply to the email. So the challenge is that if you don't sort of stop it, the whole board is kind of the one that a complaint would be filed against. So you could say, what I always tell people, sometimes town staff get copied on these emails too, I say like a nice way to say it is, I'm sharing this, let's discuss this at the next meeting, or let's hold off on talking about this till the next meeting, but I want you to be aware that, people keep coming up to me and asking about this project. So I think, putting some language in there is a good idea as a way to just remind people, if they don't know about it. And that's one of the challenges with FOI is that, people, you're all volunteers on boards and commissions, and how are you supposed to know all these different rules and requirements? And there may be very good comments that you want to share, but the thing is you want to wait, to do it at the meeting. So I think that's not a bad idea to just, somehow make it clear, hey, I'm bringing this up. Or you could always say, look, I want to add this to the agenda. Let's talk about it at the meeting. This is my idea for whatever the issue is. Anyone else on emails or meetings? Okay. So we'll talk now kind of about the ground rules for meetings and the different types of meetings that are allowed under the law. So with any public meeting, again, anyone can attend a public meeting. It doesn't matter if they live in town. It doesn't matter if it's the reporter and you don't want them. Whatever it is, anyone's allowed to attend. You can set your own rules for public comment. You could have a sign-in sheet, but no one's required to sign in. Sometimes with public comment, if you ask people to give their name for public comment, that's okay. You can't ask people their name at the door when they're coming in. One thing with attendance of meetings that comes up sometimes is, you've got a pretty sizable room here, but sometimes you get, a big controversial issue. There's a ton of people that come out for a meeting, and you're looking at the, fire marshal capacity, and you're saying, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? If you ever run into a situation where there's more people that want to attend the meeting than can fit into the room, you have to either move the meeting to another place or you have to postpone it. Because if someone's not allowed access, again, that's what FOIA is about, access. I grew up in Chester, and this actually happened. There was an issue where it was in planning and zoning, and somehow they wanted to introduce an ordinance to ban roosters. And people got very mad about this because they wanted to save the roosters. It became this whole big campaign, there were too many people that came out to the town hall for the meeting. They had to move it to our elementary school and do it in the gym because it was the biggest building that they had in town. So just know, you want to be aware that it's about access, and sometimes with these bigger issues, controversial issues, just be mindful that if people can't get into the meeting, that's something that they could file a complaint over. Anyone can photograph, record, or broadcast. Oh, yes?
When a meeting needs to be relocated, is there a proper process, like recessing to determine and then posting and announcing? Or
yeah, so if you do that under the law, it's called, you're basically adjourning the meeting. So what you should do is, if you get there and they decide, okay, we can't do it, you would have to, if you know where you're going to go, like let's say you want to move across the street or something like that, you could just say, look, we're adjourning the meeting to 7 o'clock across the street at the library. Or if you don't know when it's going to continue, you would just say, we are adjourning tonight's meeting to a future date. There'll be a notice posted at the town hall. So you can, if you adjourn it, if you know where you're going to go and when, you announce it at the meeting, and you would put a notice in the town hall. If you don't know when it's going to be, you just say we're adjourning it, and then as soon as you know the date and the time, you would post the notice at the town hall.
And you stated that it's for capacity reasons.
Yeah, you're adjourning it because the attendance has exceeded the capacity. Yeah, I just mentioned that one because it does come up sometimes, and that's a surefire way for someone to file a complaint, because if they're being told you can't come to the meeting, they're going to be angry, and they're going to likely want to try to do something or call me, and it won't necessarily end well. So. All right, so anyone can photograph, record, or broadcast a public meeting. I always say I would hope that you don't say anything at a public meeting that you wouldn't want recorded, but just know someone out in the audience can be recording. They don't have to give you prior permission or a heads up or anything like that. If it's a public meeting, it can be recorded. So now we'll talk about the different types of meetings that are allowed under the law. There's regular meetings, there's special meetings, and there's emergency meetings. Regular meeting is a meeting that's on your regular meeting schedule. So the deadline just passed, so hopefully all your boards and commissions have done this, but you should file with your clerk a list of your regular meetings for the year. We're going to meet the first Tuesday of every month. We're going to meet the second and fourth Wednesdays of every month. Those are your regular meetings, which goes on your regular meeting schedule. It's filed with your town clerk. A special meeting, the name always drives me a little crazy because people, especially if you're new to it, you say, oh my God, special meeting, what does it mean? We can't take up this or we can't do that. The only thing that makes a special meeting is it's just not on your regular meeting schedule. So it's just a different day of the week. It could be a different time if it's earlier in the day. Holidays, and you have to move the meeting to a different day, or you want to add meetings, and maybe it's a busy time of year for your board. You want to add meetings. It's summer. You need to move to accommodate members' vacations. Anytime you change the schedule of your meeting, it's a special meeting. The only difference, practical difference with a special meeting is you can't add any items to the agenda at a special meeting. If you did not know, at a regular meeting of a board, by a 2/3 vote, you can add items to the agenda. So if you come to the night of the meeting and maybe based on public comment, there's something that comes up, or maybe you're thinking about, gee, we talked about this last month, but we never really concluded it, and I think we need to address it. You see on the agenda new business. Anyone have any new business? At a regular meeting, you can add things to the agenda for discussion by a 2/3 vote. At a special meeting, you can't. So if you're ever having a special meeting, I always just say, take a second look at the agenda, make sure anything you would want to talk about is on there, because you can't go back and add things later. You could always not do everything on the agenda. There's no requirement that you have to take up everything that's on there. So you can always put things on there, and if you don't get to them, you don't get to them. But at a special meeting, if you had extra time, or you wanted to take up something, if it wasn't on the agenda, you can't do that.
Do you know why they decided that?
I think it's to do with the fact that there's less notice of a special meeting, because again, regular meeting, everyone knows it's on your regular meeting schedule. For a special meeting, you have to file a notice with the clerk no sooner than at least 24 hours before the meeting. Agendas for both regular and special meetings need to be filed 24 hours ahead of time. So a special meeting, your notice is basically going to be your agenda. Your agenda is going to say, special meeting, Tuesday, 6:30, town hall. For regular meetings, your agenda, still have the time and place, but the time and place is known because it's on your regular meeting schedule. And then with special meetings, again, because it's a deviation from your normal operating procedure, those agendas do have to get posted on the website. I think most towns post pretty much all their agendas on the website, but legally, those ones absolutely have to get posted. If a regular meeting agenda is not posted on the website within 24 hours, but it's in the town clerk's office, maybe it gets posted the morning of. If it was there 24 hours before, you're okay, but with a special meeting, it's got to be in the office 24 hours ahead of time, and it's got to be on the website. So if someone looks on the website, the special meeting agenda is not there, and the meeting is less than 24 hours away, that would be a potential FOIA violation. And then the third type of meeting that's allowed under the law is what's called an emergency meeting. And as the name suggests, only in the event of an emergency. What is not an emergency, and this is a true story, is, I've gotten calls from people where, oh my gosh, somebody was sick, we didn't get the agenda to town hall in time, we forgot there was a Monday holiday, it's a Tuesday meeting, we brought the agenda in Tuesday, can we make our meeting an emergency meeting? It should be obvious, but the answer is no. Emergency meetings are really only for, a bona fide emergency, something where you can't wait 24 hours to have a special meeting. If you remember what I said earlier, special meetings 24 hours, so there is a lot of flexibility there if boards or commissions need to meet quickly, but emergency meetings allow you to do it immediately because there's no agenda and there's no public notice. So you basically are saying whatever we have to do is so important, we cannot give time for the public to know, we just have to get together and do it. Some examples of where we saw this. Severe weather could be something where you have to have an emergency meeting. Your board of selectmen needs to get together because you're appropriating funds, you're hiring a contractor to clear snow or something like that. We saw it during COVID. There were public health orders coming from the state. The situation was changing, quite literally on like an hour-to-hour basis. So there were towns where they were having to have emergency meetings, trying to take in all this information. I'll give you an example of what's not an emergency meeting, and it's kind of interesting because this also sort of dovetails with people ask often, what can happen if there's a violation, with meetings. Piece I think a lot of people know, the commission can order the production of records. So if there's a dispute about public records, somebody files a complaint with us, we could say, no, town of Plainfield, you have to release those records. Your police department has to give that report to that person. Your public works department needs to give those budget documents to that person. But what about meetings, right? What happens if there's the agenda doesn't get posted, someone gets kicked out of the meeting, what happens if they file a complaint? The strongest thing the commission can do with meetings is we can actually declare null and void any actions that were taken at an improper meeting. So, if your planning and zoning commission, approved the controversial apartment building project, but the agenda wasn't filed on time, or, people couldn't get in the meeting because it reached capacity, the commission could come in and say, no, that didn't happen, you have to go back and you have to do it again. So, it doesn't happen too often, but I'll just share a little story, about, what is not an emergency meeting. It's sort of, I share this because people often ask me, what's the worst that could happen? And this is sort of kind of the worst that could happen. So, this goes back now, it's about 10 or 15 years ago, and it was a town down in Fairfield County, and their fire chief was retiring, and so they were looking for someone to replace him. And initially they told the deputy fire chief, hey, we're going to pick you, you're going to be the next fire chief. The guy had been in the department for a long time, he was very excited about this, he went and started telling friends and family, colleagues, all this is great, I'm going to be the fire chief. But then a couple days go by and they decide they want to go into a different direction. And the first selectman has the uncomfortable job of going in and telling this guy who was told he was going to get the job, actually, you're not going to get the job. You can imagine he was disappointed, but more than that, he was angry, and there was yelling, and there was shouting, and it turned into this whole situation where this big blow-up happened in town hall. Other people heard it. I think things were thrown. It was just this really, really messy situation, and he storms out of the town hall. And other people hear this, and then the other selectmen catch wind of it, and they all go to the first selectman, and they say, you got to do something about this, right? This guy was being insubordinate, the way he was treating you, the things he was saying, this is disrespectful. Again, we talked about the different types of meeting. Instead of saying, hey, maybe we schedule a special meeting, or we bring it up at the next Board of Selectmen meeting, for whatever reason, they decided, no, this is worthy of an emergency meeting. So that night, the clerk for the Board of Selectmen calls all the selectmen, calls the deputy, tells everyone, hey, we're having an emergency meeting in town hall to talk about what happened. So they have an emergency meeting the next morning. It was actually a Saturday morning, so they go and they collect the deputy fire chief and the selectmen, and they come to town hall on a Saturday morning. And it's more yelling, more shouting. He can't believe how he's been treated. They can't believe the things he said. And the meeting ends with basically the deputy fire chief says, "I'm retiring," and then the board of selectmen says, "Nuh-uh, we're firing you." So at the end of the meeting, he leaves and he's no longer working as the deputy fire chief. But if you remember what I said earlier, we can declare things null and void. So this deputy fire chief filed a complaint with the commission. I don't know if he attended a training session like this. He hired an attorney. Somebody told him, "Hey, you ought to file a complaint." So he filed a complaint, and the commission agreed with him, and he won his case. And we said, "Yep, that was an improper meeting. So your firing or resignation, whatever happened, is null and void." And this is an important thing to know, is if you don't like a decision that the commission makes, you can sue us and appeal in court. And so that's what happened in this case. The town said, "No, we think that was an emergency dealing with this fire chief." So they sued the commission in court. And they lost in Superior Court. They went all the way to the state Supreme Court, and they lost all along the way. So at the end of this, 3 or 4 years later, the state Supreme Court said, "No, that was not an emergency meeting." If you know anything about the court system, as I said, this takes time. And now let's think for a second that this was a guy who was taken off the town payroll 3 or 4 years ago, and then 3 or 4 years later, the court said, "No, that was not properly done." So then, after losing at the Supreme Court, the next thing this town had to do was figure out how much back pay they were going to pay the deputy fire chief so that he wouldn't sue them because he hadn't been getting paid for all that time, and they basically fired him improperly. So, again, that's kind of a once-in-a-lifetime thing that's probably never, ever going to happen again as long as we're alive, but I share it because it's, the most extreme example of the worst that can happen if something, if there's an improper thing that happens with a meeting, a notice isn't done, somebody's kicked out, something like that. So I share that to say, it's frustrating when these things happen, especially if someone brings it to your attention, "Oh my gosh, we didn't post the agenda on time." I strongly encourage you not to move forward with the meetings in that case because you don't want to wind up in front of the FOI commission with a complaint filed. You don't want to end up having to redo, votes and things that you took at that meeting. So if you find yourself in one of those situations, it's frustrating, but try to find an alternate date. You could schedule a special meeting. It could even be the next night if you wanted to. Find a date, make sure the notices are proper, and take the steps so that the public has proper notice of your meetings. Any questions on it? Yes?
In regards to meetings, what happens when it goes into an executive session?
So we will talk, there's one part and then executive session, so that's coming up. Okay.
I got a quick one on
Yes.
that. Did you get a follow-up on it? Did they redo the meeting?
I think the fire chief did not, they didn't end up redoing the meeting because he reached a settlement with them where they paid him to basically go away. So the next thing we'll talk a little bit about is electronic remote meetings. Do your boards or commissions do any of that? Zoom, hybrid? Not too much?
Not anymore.
All right, so I won't spend too much time on it. Just a couple things to know is if you can do electronic meetings, it's not required, so there's no requirement. If you want to do them, great. If you want to do it back in person like you used to, that's fine too. But just a couple things. If you have an electronic meeting, a regular meeting of your board and commission, and it's electronic, there's a Zoom link, it's either all online or a hybrid meeting. The agendas are always 24 hours in advance, but for electronic meetings, there's a 48-hour notice requirement with the link. So if you want to do a Zoom meeting of your board or commission, the agenda is still 24 hours, but you also have to post the Zoom link 48 hours ahead of time. And then the other thing with electronic meetings that is, I think is good to know is that people ask about recording the meetings. Do I have to record the meetings? The only meetings you have to record are if you have a regular meeting and it's online only, so everyone is online. So if you have a regular meeting of your board, everyone is on Zoom. In that instance, and only in that instance, you would need to post a recording on your website within 7 days and leave that recording on the website for at least 45 days. Another question I get sometimes with electronic meetings, if we have a recording, do we still have to do minutes? We'll talk about minutes in detail in a little later, but you always do minutes for every meeting. It doesn't matter if it's in person, electronic, you always have to do minutes. Those are the official record of the meeting. It's not an audio recording, it's not a video recording. You need to file written minutes. So executive session, that's the next thing I've got on here. So I think the important thing to know about executive session is the law is pretty specific about the reasons for an executive session. Executive session is, it's not meant to be an opportunity to discuss things that make us feel uncomfortable, or things that, gee, we really don't want to talk about this in public. It's meant to be, again, specific in the law. I had a call, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, from a town where they said, look, we're presenting our annual audit, and the auditor doesn't want to do it in public. He doesn't feel comfortable presenting at the public meeting. Can we do it in executive session? And the answer is no. If you're presenting the audit for the town, the fiscal report for the town, even if somebody doesn't want to do it in public because I don't know why, they're afraid of people watching them or something like that, that's not a proper reason for executive session. The statute's very specific. So we'll go through the reasons for executive session, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the mechanics of it, and then if we have questions on executive session, we can go through those. So the first is you can have an executive session to discuss personnel matters, and this means the conduct of a public employee, the appointment of a public employee, dismissal of a public employee. Personnel meeting, you're talking about staff, at the town. It's not about personnel budgets. It's not about those types of things. It's not the numbers of the personnel, things like that. It's about how is an employee doing his or her job. If you have a personnel executive session, you need to notify the person who's being discussed that you're having that executive session. And their right under FOI is that they can ask for that discussion to be held in public. So where this happens sometimes is, let's say, it's a police officer and the Board of Police Commissioners says, we want to have an executive session to talk about you because we think you're doing a lousy job. And the officer says, well, I think I'm doing a great job, or I'm afraid of what they're going to try to bring up, or they're going to railroad me, or whatever it may be. That person can have that discussion in public. If the person who's subject of the personnel executive session wants the discussion in public, you have to have the discussion in public. It's not a negotiating thing. If they say, I want it in open session, you have it in an open session. The next executive session is, you can have an executive session to discuss pending claims or litigation. The key thing with this is that first word, pending. So this needs to be a lawsuit that's been filed, a demand letter that has been received by the town or by your board. If you don't do this, we're going to sue you. It could be the board considering taking legal action. Your board is going to sue a state entity or something like that, or your board is going to appeal a FOI decision, whatever it may be. It could be the board is the one taking action. But again, it's got to be something imminent, that there's been something filed or is about to be filed. You can have an executive session to discuss security matters if you feel that a public session would undermine what you're talking about. The classic example I give is, let's say, your Board of Selectmen is considering purchasing a new security system for this building, and you want to talk about, where you're going to put security cameras and, what time the automatic alarms are going to go on and things like that. It would make sense to say, look, we're not going to talk about that in public because we don't want someone to learn about the different intricacies of the system, and then they could somehow use that knowledge to commit some sort of crime or break in or something like that, because they would know the parameters of the system that we wouldn't share publicly. You can have an executive session to discuss the sale or lease of property if you feel that a public discussion would impact the price. Let's say you're looking for a new piece of land for athletic fields for the high school, something like that. You find a parcel that you think works good, and in your mind you're thinking, okay, we can spend up to $500,000, but the piece of property is listed for half that. You may not want to say publicly that your budget is $500,000, because then the property owner is going to say, okay, I would like $500,000 for my piece of land. So it allows you to discuss your strategy, negotiations, and prices and things like that, either purchasing a piece of property or signing a lease. And then the last reason for an executive session is to discuss any records that are exempt from FOI. So we'll go over that more in detail in the second part of the presentation. But a couple examples. There's an attorney-client privilege under FOI, so if you ever seek a legal opinion from your town attorney, those records of that, relating to that legal opinion would be exempt. It could be a proposed settlement of a lawsuit, that would be something that would be exempt. There's also an exemption in the law. It's a little newer. It didn't always used to be this case when I started as a reporter going to town halls. I used to go to the public bid openings. Some places they still do that. Everyone gets around the contractors, and this is how much the school roof project is going to cost. But there's an exemption in the law that says, until you award a contract, you can withhold the bids and the bid documents. So a board could review bids in an executive session if they wanted to under that last category, because they're exempt records. The important thing to know about executive sessions is it's for discussion. There's no votes in executive session. The vote needs to be done in public. So some of those things we talked about, if you're going to settle a lawsuit, You got to vote in public. You can discuss in executive session the parameters of the settlement or why you want to settle it, or the town attorney may tell you, why he or she thinks it's a good idea to settle. Those are privileged discussions, but the vote to settle it would be public. Same thing with all, if you're going to fire somebody, it needs to be a public vote. If you're going to buy the security system for town hall, you don't have to talk about what's in it, but you need to vote in public to buy the system, to buy the property. So it's only for discussion. And you need to vote by 2/3 to go into executive session. So make sure that when you're doing the minutes, you reflect that there was a vote to go into executive session. Even if the only thing you're doing at a meeting is an executive session, you still need to do an agenda, you still do minutes. It still is a public meeting, even if the public is going to be kicked out 2 minutes after the meeting starts. Don't adjourn from an executive session. You should still, even if there's nobody left out in the hallway, you still technically come back into public session and the executive session. If you don't vote on anything, you can say, look, no votes were taken. Okay, we're in a motion to adjourn, and you adjourn the meeting. Don't adjourn directly from the executive session. Who can attend an executive session? Sometimes people ask about this. It's up to the board who they want to invite in. You can bring in anyone that you need, and that's the key thing that you need. You should only be bringing in town staff if you need them there to ask questions. You want their opinion on something. You need to hear someone's side of the story. You need to hear somebody's testimony on an issue. You can bring in whoever you need, but what the law basically says is they need to be a participant in that executive session. They should not be standing in the back of the room and just kind of listening to what's going on, because if you have people who are just sort of sitting and listening that aren't on the board, then they're getting this right to attend the executive session basically over members of the public who may want to be there. So the proper way to do it is, bring in the people that you need for what you need them for, and if you don't need them there any longer, tell them, okay, please go wait out in the hallway, while we deliberate. You can bring in a department head, ask them questions, and then the board can confer privately without that person there if you're done, needing to refer to them for anything. If you want them to hear what you're talking about because you want to run things by them, that's okay, but they should be participating.
Is the individual being invited in subject to the vote to go into executive session, so the board would have to vote to admit that person?
Do you mean like the personnel matter? Like if you're disciplining somebody or something?
If you're discussing a contract and you want to bring in the school superintendent.
You said you have to vote to decide who to go into?
Would you have to vote?
I don't think you would need a vote. I think it would need to be, this has come up once before. I don't think you would need a vote, but I think you would probably want the board to be in agreement upon it. Like, if one person says, I want this person to come in, and everyone else says, no, I don't think so, I don't think you necessarily have to take a vote, but I think it would kind of be the majority would sort of carry, that decision. I think, because the board makes the decision, so, again, it wouldn't be like a public vote, but I think it would be whatever the majority of the board wants to do in terms of inviting people in. So an important thing with executive sessions is agendas. So when you're preparing an agenda and you have an executive session, the way to think of it is this, is that the public doesn't get to attend your executive session. They're not going to know what the discussion was. But they have a right to know the topic being discussed. So, for personnel matters, for example, you don't want to just put executive session personnel, or you don't want to just put executive session security. Using the example of this building, if we're talking about a security system for town hall, we can put something like executive session discussion of town hall security plan. That's not revealing what the plan is or what it includes, but it's telling people, hey, we're talking about town hall security. If it's a personnel issue, you could say discussion of the performance of a police officer. Okay, we know that they're talking about some police officer. We don't know who it is. You don't have to identify the person being discussed on the agenda. But you need to give people an idea of kind of where that's going on. If it's an investigation in the fire department, personnel matter, discussion of the fire department investigation. Something so people know, you're still protecting the confidence of the executive session, but you're giving the public an idea of sort of the universe of things that are being discussed in that executive session. As I said already, you can't vote during executive session, so you want to make sure that you do your votes in public. And then, I'll mention this later when we do minutes, but when you do minutes, you also include in your minutes who was in attendance in the executive session. You can leave off anybody who was there. If it's a job interview, if you're interviewing candidates for a job, you can leave off candidates, because they maybe haven't told their other employer that they're looking for new work. But generally, you should put everyone who attended the executive session, if the town attorney was there, if the superintendent was there, public works director, whoever was there, you just list the attendance in the executive session. Anyone have any questions on executive session? Okay. The main takeaway with that I think is important, again, is that it is specific. There are good reasons to have executive sessions. I think when the legislature, put the FOI Act together, they recognize, there are times when, especially if you're dealing with legal issues or lawsuits, that it benefits the public to have those discussions in private. You don't want to reveal your security plans. You don't want to reveal your, negotiating strategy in a legal situation. But again, it's pretty limited, and it's not meant to just be, uncomfortable conversations. It's limited really by statute to those specific things. So, as if this wasn't confusing enough, the next part that we'll talk about is, I said earlier, okay, if it's a quorum and you're talking, it's a meeting, except it's not in these cases. So if you look at the definition of meeting, there's this little thing at the end that says, oh, by the way, these are things that aren't meetings. And the number one thing that you're probably aware of is caucuses. So a caucus, and this was really put in FOI for the legislature. They caucus all the time. They're caucusing before every single day they go in to vote, in the House or the Senate, going over bills and all that. But it applies at the local level too. So a caucus is members of the same board and the same political party. So it's, Republicans on the Board of Finance, it's Democrats on the Board of Education, and the caucus should really be limited to just those board members. Caucus, unlike an executive session, you don't want to start bringing in other people to your caucus. You shouldn't be bringing in your town chairman. You shouldn't be bringing in superintendent or town staff. The caucus is really an opportunity for the board members to talk about strategy, make sure everyone's on the same page. If you want to kind of, before the meeting, line up things, okay, how are we going to vote on this, or what are we going to do about this, or who's going to take this position. It's really meant for kind of a political discussion. So it makes a lot of sense up in Hartford at the Capitol, at the local level sometimes. The issues that you're dealing with are really not necessarily as political, but you still have the ability to do that. Thing that comes up now more frequently is caucuses and emails. Can we have a caucus over email? So if you had a majority of one of your boards, so a quorum of your board, but they're all of the same political party, so if your Republicans have a supermajority on your Board of Education, they're a quorum, but they're also a caucus. So if all the Republicans on the Board of Ed were emailing together, it could be considered a caucus under FOI, so it's not an illegal meeting. However, the records, the emails that they send are still public records. And the same thing goes with executive session. If you create a document in a caucus, or you create a document in an executive session, those records are not necessarily exempt. Executive sessions and caucuses allow you to meet in a situation which otherwise would be declared, an illegal meeting. You're either meeting in private at a public meeting, or you're meeting outside of a meeting with a majority of the board, but they're all of the same political party. So, if you're going to caucus and you want to have an electronic caucus over email, just be aware that, if the people on the other party come along and they make an FOI request for those emails, you can't say, oh, it was a caucus, we're not going to give them out. It would need to be something specific with an exemption that we'll talk about later. A couple of the other things that are not meetings under FOI, strategy or negotiations related to collective bargaining. So, this is probably more of like the Board of Selectmen, but, if any board is talking about union negotiations, getting updates from town staff or a union on contracts, they can do that outside of meetings. Any board can create a personnel search committee for an executive level employee. We see this a lot at school boards. Your school board will create a search committee to look for your next superintendent. Search committee could have school board members, it could have teachers, it could have members of the public, whoever they want to put on it, that's their search committee. And that search committee, I talked earlier about subcommittees, being subject to FOI. This is the one exception. So if you have a search committee, they don't have to notice their meetings, they don't have to do agendas or minutes or anything like that. They're allowed to do their work independently, and then they make a recommendation to the board, and then there will be a full, a public meeting of that board where they're going to talk about, hiring that person or whatever it may be. The last one is what's called chance or social meetings, and this is just where you have a quorum of your board together, but you're in a situation where you're not discussing board business. So you're at the restaurant, you're at the fair, you're at the gas station, you're somewhere where you're not in a setting where you're discussing board business. And that's the key thing, is that when you're in those settings, you may be friendly with your board members, you may want to go out and get dinner with fellow board members. You can do that, but when you're in those settings, when you're not at your board meeting, you really want to refrain from having discussions about board business. Things may come up, try to steer the conversation in another direction. And you want to avoid what I call the parking lot meeting, which is you have your public meeting, and then after the meeting, people mingle into the parking lot, and the board is all congregating there, and you're talking about what happened, and oh my God, can you believe this person came to public comment again, and what they said, and this, that, and the other thing. Look, if you're blowing off steam, that's okay, right? I mean, you spend a lot of time in these meetings, spend a lot of time with these people. You're probably relieved to leave sometimes at 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night if you want to talk a little bit afterwards, just sort of about how things are going or what's going on with people's lives. All that is fine. What you don't want to do is start re-bringing up the things that were talked about at the meeting. If you're on planning and zoning and you're talking, you talked about a site plan at the meeting and you continued it to the next meeting, don't go out into the hallway or go out into the parking lot and continue the discussion that you were having at the meeting. Out there. What could happen is the developer is leaving, he sees you guys talking, he files a complaint with us and he says, I saw them all in the parking lot, they were talking about my project. For all I know, they were talking about how they're going to plan to torpedo it at the next meeting. So, you can be friendly, you can be in these social settings, you can go out to dinner after the meeting, you can go to the bar after the meeting, but you want to avoid, rediscussing or bringing up the things that you talked about at the meeting. We talked already about email and meetings, just be mindful about email and text messages. And then the last thing with meetings that that we'll talk about is minutes. The most important thing I think for everyone, if anyone in here in the room does minutes, I do the minutes for our commission meetings. You can be brief. Brevity goes a long way with minutes. The only legal requirement that you need for minutes is who was at the meeting, the timing, when things happened, any votes that were cast, who was in attendance at an executive session, and that's it. You don't need to put every single person that spoke at public comment. People don't have a right to attach items to the minutes. That happens sometimes. I know people come up here after the meeting, hey, here's my comments, put this in the minutes, or they read something out loud, I want you to read this into the minutes, I want every word of this in the minutes. The person taking the minutes is in control. Now, you're going to put more than just the votes that happened at the meeting. You want to fill it out a little bit. You want to give people an idea of the flavor of the meeting and sort of the important points. But the most important thing with minutes is that they need to be filed within 7 days after the meeting. That's what the law requires. If you filed 15-page minutes, but they take you a month, we may say, hey, that's great, a lot of detail, but that's a violation because they weren't filed within 7 days. So you don't want to let complexity and length and, having to get 17 people to review them. You don't want to let all that get in the way of getting the minutes filed with the clerk within 7 days. I know sometimes people will say, gee, the board doesn't meet for 2 weeks. How are we supposed to file the minutes? They haven't been approved. They haven't been voted on. If it makes you feel better, you can call them draft. You can call them unapproved. You can put subject to approval. If there's any changes to the minutes, you can always reflect that in the next set of minutes, right? The next meeting, they voted to change something in the minutes. You can just follow up on it in the next meeting's minutes. So, as I said, brevity goes a long way. You want to capture the spirit of the discussion, but you don't have to. It's not meant to be a transcript. It's not meant to be a replacement for somebody attending the meeting. It's the record for the town. So again, you're going to want to make sure that you capture what happened, but just know that you're in control of the minutes. People don't have a right to be in the minutes or to add things to the minutes or anything like that. Anyone have any questions on minutes?
Is that 7 business days from the meeting? Or?
It is. There's actually, it's a small distinction, but for a regular meeting, it's 7 calendar days. For a special meeting, it's 7 business days. So special meetings, you get a little extra time. Regular meeting, just 7 days. Special meeting is 7 business days. And another thing I'll point out too is at the local level, what the statute says is the minutes need to be available for public inspection. So if they're not posted on the website, that's not a violation. They need to be at the clerk's office or at your business, if it's Board of Education, at the Board of Education office, they need to be available for public inspection. But if they get posted on the website 2 weeks later, that's okay. It's just that they need to be, make sure they get to the clerk and that they're there within the 7 days. I will say, however, if you can get them up online within the 7 days, it's a good idea because I think more and more that's where people look for them. I will get calls from towns where people say, the meeting was 8 days ago, the minutes aren't online, should I file a complaint? And I have to be like, hold on, no, it's okay. Because there's a different standard. If it's a state agency, us for example, our commission meetings, we have to post all our minutes online within 7 days. That used to be the case at the local level, but they changed it, early on because a lot of towns were kind of pushing back. They didn't all have websites, and it was more of a challenge. I think now a lot of towns do have pretty good websites. You get these platforms where it's a template and it's easier, and I think town websites have really come a long way in the last 15 or 20 years. But the law has not changed. So if your minutes are not online within 7 days, that's not a violation. But as long as they're in the office, if they're not filed within 7 days, that's the issue. If they don't come into the clerk's office until 2 weeks later and they're stamped late, that's the concern with minutes. Yes.
With attachments on something like Board of Finance, when they attach their budgets or their proposed budgets, things like that, do I have to preserve them, record them with the minutes? I'm already recording them in the town record book. I'm obviously have their budget filed, but then I'm also paying to have them recorded in the Board of Finance archival book, which is very redundant.
Yeah, so we wouldn't, it's not a requirement under FOI. It's really up to how the board wants to do it. If the board wants you to put them in the minutes, that's their choice. But if they say, look, okay, they're in other places, they don't legally need to be in the minutes. So if you want to, put them in the other places and tell people that's where they can look, they don't need to be in the minutes. If you want to attach them, you could, but there's not a requirement. Yes.
I got one. I've seen something where it talks about the 48-hour window for the action items.
The action, okay, yeah. So this doesn't come up as frequently, so sometimes I don't even mention it, but there's also, before minutes, there's a requirement under the law, and I think most people don't know about this because I very rarely get people asking about it, but you're supposed to file what are a recording of the votes within 48 hours after the meeting. What I suggest boards do, an easy way to do this is you can take an agenda and you could just mark up an agenda, and even if it's an agenda and you just kind of write the votes in the margin and give that, send that into the clerk, that can be your, some places call it action minutes. I've seen that before, but really it's just you need to have a record of the votes. If someone comes in 2 days after the meeting and they want to know how the votes went, there needs to be something available, but it could be as simple as an agenda that you mark up, and then the minutes can come within the 7 days. But good question. Anyone else on minutes? Okay. So before we move on to records, any other questions on anything to do with meetings, public meetings, agendas, notices? Yes.
Can you use your personal laptop, say you're the secretary of the board?
That's a good question, because I do bring that up usually a little bit later. But let's talk about personal devices. So, what makes something a public record is the content of the record. So, if you use your personal laptop, but you're using it to create documents or things that are related to board business, those are public records that somebody could make an FOI request for. Where this comes up a lot is with, we talked about email and text messages, and again with email and text messages. Now I know the town is not providing you all with cell phones to do your board business, so you're using your personal cell phones, which is fine. And you're probably using, personal emails too, or work emails, which is fine. The key thing though is that if you're using your personal email or personal cell phone to conduct town business, you need to remember that those are public records that somebody could request. Somebody could make a request and say, I want all your text messages between you and the planning and zoning chairman, and those are on your personal phone. Now, it doesn't mean that that requester or the commission or anyone else is going to go through your phone and find them, but it means that you would have to go through your phone and identify the ones that were responsive. If you're texting the planning and zoning chairman because your kids are on the same soccer team and you're talking about soccer, those are not public records. But anything that pertains to public business, those would be public records that you would need to provide. About personal devices, we saw that a lot during COVID. People said, well, I'm working at home and it's on my personal laptop. If the record is created, in the course of town business or relates to your board business, those are what would be public records that would fall under FOI.
That was a question, because I asked other people who were not able to attend if they could just send me some questions, and that was the one that I did get. The use of a laptop to keep the minutes while your meeting's going on is fine.
Yes, yeah, that's fine. One thing too that comes up sometimes too is texting during meetings. So people ask about that. If you're texting fellow board members about what's going on at the meeting while the meeting is happening, I think it's just kind of rude. I think you should, hopefully pay attention to what's happening and you're not texting comments back and forth. But in the event that you were, if it related to what was going on at the meeting, those are public records that somebody could request. So if you're saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe this developer, he's so stupid, you know, that's a public record that somebody could request. So, you know, you just want to be mindful of that as well. So, so now we'll talk a little bit about, you know, about records and FOI requests and public records. So, I like to read a little bit from the definition of public records just because it's really quite broad. And again, as I really said, it's basically anything that touches your board business. What it specifically says under the law is it's any recorded data or information relating to the conduct of the public's business, prepared, owned, used, received, or retained by a public agency, or to which a public agency is entitled to receive a copy by law or contract. Whether such data or information be handwritten, typed, tape recorded, videotaped, printed, photostated, photographed, or recorded by any other method. And except as otherwise provided by any federal law or state statute, all records maintained or kept on file by any public agency, whether or not such records are required by any law or by any rule or regulation, shall be public records, and every person shall have the right to inspect such records promptly during regular office or business hours, or copy such records. So again, you know, it's really anything that touches on town business. It's text messages, it could be Facebook messages, it's emails, you know, written correspondence, documents, anything that deals with town business is a public record. And then that second part there, basically, unless there is another law on the books at the state level or the federal level, or there's an exemption within our law, which we'll go through, unless there's something that says in the law somebody's not entitled to that, they're entitled to receive a copy or they can look to inspect records. The presumption in Connecticut and FOI is the presumption is disclosure. The concept is everything is a public record unless there's an exemption. And you know, the exemptions used to be pretty narrow. It's gotten a little bit more broad. You know, we'll go through those more in detail. But I just want you to be thinking as you're doing your work on your boards, as you're sending emails and corresponding with people on the board, or you're writing reports or whatever it is that you're doing, you know, most of the work that you do, most of the things that you discuss, you know, really, unless it's a legal issue, you know, unless it's dealing with, you know, some purchasing things like bids we talked about, by and large, most of the things that you create when you're on a board or commission are going to be public records that somebody can come along and make a request for. So we'll talk about FOI requests. You know, first, like I said earlier, you know, about the 4 days and all that, you know, the processing of them. I think the most important thing to know, a couple important things to know. First is that any request for records in Connecticut, a request for public records, any request for public records is an FOI request. They don't need to say Freedom of Information Act. They don't need to fill out a special form or anything. If you're on a board or commission and someone emails you and says, hi, I would like a copy of your emails, you know, between you and the chairman for the last 6 months, that's an FOI request. If you get an FOI request, number one important thing, you need to acknowledge the request within 4 business days. This kind of goes back to, you know, again, the laws from 1975. There's this piece in there that says that if a person doesn't get an acknowledgement of their request within 4 business days, the request is considered denied under the law. The reason that's in there is because in 1975, people were putting their requests in the mail. So they put something in that basically required agencies at that time to mail them a letter back so they know that the request was received and they knew that the agency was going to work on it. You know, in this day and age, it's email, it's a lot quicker, but just make sure that you get something back to the requester acknowledging that you got the request. You don't have to promise them that you're going to produce any records. You don't have to give them a timeline. You really don't have to say anything other than, you know, we've received this. If you want to say more, you can, but just make sure that you get something back to them. Because if you don't, again, under the law, they can consider the request denied. They could file a complaint with us even if you started going through the records, going through your emails, pulling it together. Even if you were doing everything right, if you never respond to the person, they don't know that you received the request, and they could file a complaint with us. And there are people out there who are very impatient, and they will file a complaint, you know, 5 days later if they don't hear anything back. So, you know, make sure whenever you get a request, I should point out it's 4 days of when you receive it. So if it's a holiday or you're on vacation or it's the weekend, you know, those don't count. But once you see the request come in, make sure somebody gets back to the person within 4 days. If it's not you, if it's your chairman or your town attorney or whoever it is, just make sure somebody gets that acknowledgement back. So now, you know, we'll also talk about what you don't have to do. What is not an FOI request? I think this is also really important to know. So an FOI request needs to be a request for specific documents. You know, I want your emails from this date to this date. I want a copy of the report that the board was reviewing at the meeting last night. I want a copy of the budget from the last fiscal year. It needs to be a specific request for certain documents. that you have. That's an important thing too. If you don't have something, you're not required to go find it and hunt it down. If it's not in your, if it's not a record that you keep, if you're on planning and zoning and someone asks you for something that is, at the Economic Development Commission, you can tell them, hey, you got to go there. You're not required to fetch records from other agencies. It's only what you have. But what you don't have to do is, you don't have to do research. You don't have to create records that don't already exist. If somebody, this is a real thing, a couple weeks ago from a police department, they got a call from a personal injury law firm who said, give me the list of everyone who's been in a car accident in your town in the last year. If you know anything about police departments, you know they don't have a big list of everyone who gets into a car accident. If you get into a car accident, they don't write your name onto the list. So in that case, the police department told the requester, we don't have that list, and we're not going to make it for you, right? You're not obligated to create records that don't exist. So in that case, what that personal injury law firm had to do was request all the accident reports for that period of time, go through them all, write down all the information that they wanted. So if the information is in 10 different reports, you can tell the person, okay, these are the 10 reports that it's in. You need to pull it out together yourself. You need to compile it in the way that you want. The same thing goes with file formats. If your budget is a PDF or this document's in this format, you don't need to convert it into something else. You're not, this is one that people find surprising sometimes. You're not required to answer questions under FOI. Somebody may, I imagine it may ask you, why did your board do this? Who thought this was a good idea? How did this happen? Who allowed this to happen? If you get anything like that where it's questions, if you feel comfortable answering the question, you can answer the question, right? You're on a board or commission, you're doing town work, you want to let people know what's going on, you can certainly answer questions. When people email me all the time with FOI questions, I try to answer them, that's my job. But just know that's not an FOI request, so there's no requirement that you respond within a certain day. Nobody can file a complaint with you because they don't like the answers to your questions. Or if somebody's bombarding you with all kinds of questions and you don't have the time or you don't know the answers, you can stop responding and you're not going to run the risk of an FOI violation. The way that I like to think of it is, you're providing people with records that they're looking for, but they need to do the homework themselves. Whatever they want to do with it is their business, but they need to do that themselves. You're not there to answer their questions about the records or to make an analysis or make conclusions based on the records. You're just giving them access to the records. So somebody files an FOI request, you acknowledge it within 4 business days, and then another really super frequent question I get is how long do we have to fulfill a request? And I get it from requesters who are upset that they don't have the records yet, and I get it from towns that get these gigantic FOI requests and they're looking at it and they're saying, like you said, 1,000 pages, oh my God, what do we do? So what the law says is that you need to fulfill requests for public records promptly, which is not very helpful, right? And promptly doesn't, what does that mean? So early on in the life of the law, the commission used to do these advisory opinions where we would try to sort of explain the statute a little bit more and give some guidance. So there is one that deals with promptness because, as you can imagine, it was a common question in the early days and it still is today. So what I can tell you is these are the factors that we look at if somebody files a complaint against you and says, look, Plainfield's not being prompt. This is what we would look at. It's like a test that we apply. We look at these different things and we say, okay, did they do this? Did they do this? Based on all these different factors. So factors we consider include the volume of records requested. If somebody wants years worth of records, we understand that you're a part-time member of a board or commission. If they want all your emails for 2 years, it's going to take you some time to do that. We understand that. So those are going to take longer than a request for 1 or 2 documents. Along with that, the amount of personnel time necessary to comply with the request. Sometimes requests require redactions. You may need to go to the first selectman to ask him about something. You may need to go to your town attorney. Some requests are simple, others are more complex. So the complexity of it is part of that too. Time constraints that the agency is under to complete other work. If you're on the Board of Finance and you're in the middle of budget season, that's obviously going to take priority over maybe an FOI request. Doesn't mean that you never fulfill the FOI request, but it means that maybe for a period of time, the FOI work is going to sort of be subjugated to some of the budget work that you do where there's a pressing deadline. So it's really this balancing act. And it's not easy. I do the FOI requests that we get at the commission, and believe it or not, we get 25 or 30 a year because there are people who are upset about their case and the decision that didn't go in their way, and so they're asking us for copies of emails because they think we were talking about them, and that we don't like them or what have you. So, or they want old decisions. To your point, they want us to go into the basement and pull things from the 1970s or something like that. So it does happen, and it's a challenge because you're trying to balance that with everything else that you do. The way to approach it, in my view, is if it's a big records request, You can always ask the requester to narrow their request. If they want years worth of records, you can always go to them and say, hey, could I give you the last 6 months? And then you see if you need more. If somebody wants, this happens sometimes where people will ask for, I want every email about the firehouse project, every email that you sent about this gigantic thing that's been going on for 60 years, and you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do? But maybe you know that your board recently did a report on that topic, or there was a meeting where there was something that kind of summarizes where everything stands. There's nothing that prohibits you from going to the requester and trying to help them, by saying, look, here's this report I could give you. This may answer a lot of your questions. Do you want to review it and then see what other records you need? Or you can always ask a requester, what they're really after. Sometimes people make these big requests because they know they have something in their mind they want answered. They have a question, or they think something happened, and they're trying to find out, to get to the bottom of it, and they know about FOI, and they say, well, if I ask for everything, maybe somewhere in there will be this thing that I'm looking for. But you can always go to them and say, well, what is it that you're looking for? And maybe what it is that you're looking for, maybe what they're looking for you don't have, and you can tell them that, and then you save all this trouble of having, you can search through all these documents, provide them with all this stuff, and then they don't find what they're looking for, and then they're mad at you because they, whatever this thing is that they wanted doesn't exist. So I think communication with requesters is important. Sometimes we view FOI requests as kind of an adversarial thing. Who is this person? Why do they want this? What are they doing? I think at the end of the day, you have to remember these are public records. These are people that live in the town that you're doing this work for, and they have questions about the work that you're doing. And you can't try to get into the motives of people. I know sometimes people get concerned because, oh my gosh, someone's doing this for political purposes, or you get nervous about what they're going to do with the information once they get it. None of that is contemplated under the law. It's really about, is it a public record? If it is, the person gets access to it. If it's not, you don't have to give it to them, which we'll talk about in a second with some of the exemptions. But again, I think communication with requesters is key. Another thing I do with the commission is I review the complaints that we get in, and a lot of times where I see people file complaints is because it's radio silence on the other end. They don't get a response. Or they got a response, in the beginning, hey, this is, we'll work on this for you, I'll let you know. And then they're asking every month, hey, how's it going, and they never hear anything. And then enough time goes by, they get frustrated, and they file a complaint. So try to stay in communication with requesters. You can break a big request up into pieces. You can give people documents on a rolling basis. There's all these sort of tricks that you can do in ways to try to make it easier. You can set aside time every week to work on an FOI request. The challenge is that there's no limitation on what somebody can ask for. There's no such thing as an FOI request that's too big. So some people will make these big requests, but I think if you try to steer them in a direction with the mindset of, look, I want to help you get what you're asking for as quickly and as efficiently as possible so that you get what you want quicker, and that I'm not searching through all this stuff that you don't want, or I'm not printing 1,000 pages that you don't come and pick up, try to work with the requester. Last thing on FOI requests that we'll talk about is fees. So there's no fee for digital records under FOI, partially because it's a law from 1975. There really weren't digital records at the time. So it's not that there is a section that says you can't charge for digital records. It's just there's a section that talks about what you can charge for. It doesn't talk about digital records. So if somebody wants emails, you have to provide those free of charge, PDFs, anything on a computer. There's no charge for your time that it takes you to compile the records or searching for the records. If somebody wants paper records, you can charge them 50 cents a page for paper records, and then with digital records, if you had to buy a flash drive or something like that, you could charge them for the cost of any storage medium if you had to purchase that to fulfill the request. So before we get into the exemptions and the exclusions, what's not covered under FOI, anyone have any questions about records requests, fulfilling records requests? Yes?
Is there a cutoff for when a member is no longer part of the board that they can't receive or can't action on an FOI request the same way they would as when they're an active member on that board?
So I think this is the part where I get to say about records retention, which is not us. So the way it works is if you have the records, you're obligated to provide them. So I think in that instance, if it's for ex-board members, it would depend on what the town still retains or still has. So if the town has things that belong to somebody who was previously on the board, those are still public records. But the person who is not on the board anymore is not, if they don't have the work that they did, if they deleted everything when they left the board, or they didn't keep copies of it, they're not subject to the FOI request. Does that make sense? If the town retains it, or the town has things that used to be there, it's about what records are available. Or, you know, that project was 6 years ago, I don't have those anymore. There is it's at the Connecticut State Library on their website. There's a list of the schedules for records retention, and it kind of depends on the content of it. But like emails, for example, I think it's something like most emails you're supposed to keep for 2 years, and then you can delete them unless it's like a transitory email, or if it's a copy of something. If someone sends you a copy of another record, like an agenda, you know, you can delete those. But there are records retention rules. So if it falls outside of those, or if the person doesn't have it anymore, I mean, that's the most common thing we run into, is that if you're not on the board anymore, okay, I don't have anything anymore, then FOI is only about providing what you have. So if you don't have the records, you know, you don't need to provide them. What you should not do, I hope no one would do this, but we did have a case of this last year, is if you get an FOI request, for the love of God, don't go and delete the records that the person requested. We had a case where that happened in a town on a police commission, where somebody got an FOI request and then went in and started deleting the records that the person requested, and it came out, so please don't do that. But if you don't have it anymore, you have no obligation to provide it.
So I think you mentioned, like, for 2 years, there's almost...
Yeah, I would check the, again, it's called the Office of the Public Records Administrator. Office of Public Records Administrator at the Connecticut State Library, and they have all the rules about how long you're supposed to keep things for a certain period of time. But by and large, I think most of the time, if somebody's not on the board anymore, the town has to, other board members in the town have to look and see, what they may have. So like if you had, for example, if you're on the board still and you have emails from that person, those are still public records because they're sitting in your email inbox, but it's not, his email inbox may not have anything anymore because he's not on the board or commission. Any other questions on records requests?
Back on the media thing, does that mean I have to maintain all my emails from the town for the board that I'm on?
It's not all of them. So that's not under FOI. It's a different statute. So I would check with them and look on the website there and see. The 2 years is kind of a general thing, but certain ones are not going to fall into that. Like I said, a lot of times, if it's something, like if it's a communication that goes out to all the board members or something like that, you're receiving a copy of something, so you don't necessarily need to keep those. It would more be about, correspondence related to particular projects or things like that. But again, we don't enforce records retention. We just say, look, if you have it, you have to provide it. If you don't have it, you don't have to provide it. But again, the records retention rules say how long you're supposed to keep things, and there's certain, timelines depending on what the content of the record is. Towns have to keep budgets for a certain amount of years longer and things like that. Anyone else? Okay. So next we'll talk about, what's not covered under FOI. So, as I said, the way the law works really is that, everything is public record unless there's either another law that says otherwise, or there's an exemption within our law. So what the other laws, we call them the exceptions, because the law says except as otherwise provided by any federal law or state statute. The challenge with the exceptions to FOI is that they are all throughout the state statutes, all over the place. There's really no rhyme or reason for some of them. The one example I always use, and I don't do it to beat up on teachers, my wife is a teacher, but there's a law that says if you're a public school teacher, your employee evaluation is not disclosable under FOI. If you're a police officer, if you're a firefighter, I can go and ask for a copy of your performance evaluation. If you're a public school teacher, I cannot, because there's a law that specifically exempts public school teacher evaluations. If you know anything about the Capitol and lobbying in Hartford, there's all kinds of groups that go up there all the time and they say, well, we want this exempt or we want this exempt. So the challenge is that I have these little booklets you can grab at the end. They talk about the exemptions that are within FOI, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. And those are the ones that people know more commonly: attorney-client privilege, or personnel records, or preliminary drafts. But then there's also all these other statutes all throughout. There's different rules depending on what it is. There's boards of ethics have a different way that they operate. A lot of state agencies, Department of Children and Families, you won't find anything in the FOI Act that says those records are exempt. But there's a statute in the DCF law that says, the records of their cases and things like that, you can't FOI DCF about an investigation. So I say that to say that, one of the trickier parts of FOI is all these other laws. So if you work in a particular area, if you're on a public health board or you're on a land use board, it's a good idea to check the statutes that kind of talk about the work that you do, or check with, one of the groups that represents those boards, the statewide associations, because there could be other rules that are sort of not in, other things dealing with records that are not in the FOI Act that you need to be aware of. And sometimes there's even little things about meetings too that are in there. For example, there's a requirement that you have to do audio recordings of certain land use boards. I think it's inland wetlands and planning and zoning. That's not found in FOI, but it's in those statutes for land use, because if someone wants to appeal, their site plan got denied and they want to go to court, the judge needs a recording of the meeting to understand what happened so that they can use that as part of the appeal. So there's all these different kinds of things out there, things that are not covered. Do you guys have town meeting government or no? Annual town meeting. So annual town meetings are not covered under FOI, believe it or not. It's a different statute. So the thing about the notice going in the newspaper, so there's all these different things with records and meetings sometimes where there's going to be different circumstances depending on the work that you're doing. So the news didn't say, right? The news just said this happened on Long Island Sound. And it turned out that, because public health investigated that, the information about where it happened was exempt. So we didn't learn what town this flesh-eating bacteria was. We just know it was somewhere in Long Island Sound. So there's all these different things, that are not in FOI. We'll cover next what's in FOI, but I just say that as kind of a word of caution. If you work in a particular area, just try to get familiar with the things that, that are covered by that. There's exemptions for police records in our law, but then there's also a whole statute about, juvenile police records, and there's, what happens when a case gets erased or nollied. You won't find that in FOI, but those records can't be disclosed based on those other statutes. So the exemptions probably are more familiar with. So what the law says is you don't need to release anything. We'll go through them. Preliminary drafts or notes, so anything that is considered to be a preliminary draft or personal notes. Personal notes, you should be thinking, like let's say executive session. If you're in an executive session, you're taking some notes down about what's going on, on the agenda. You're writing down your thoughts about what you may want to do based on that. You don't share them with anybody. It's your memory aid. You use it to recall what happened in a future meeting. Those are personal notes. You wouldn't necessarily have to disclose those under FOI. What is not a personal note is you're in the executive session, you take some notes, you go back to your computer, you type up an email, you send it to all your board members, then you've created a new record that could be disclosed. And then preliminary drafts, typically it's, if a board requests the staff to produce some kind of report, you're on the Board of Finance and you want some sort of staffing report about town hall and the different positions and how much they're paid and all that kind of stuff. There could be different versions of that report that this town hall staff are working on until they give it to you, until it's submitted for action or consideration or approval or review to your board or commission. It could be a preliminary draft that you wouldn't need to release. So the key thing with preliminary drafts is it's before a decision is being made. Once something comes to your board, once your board has it, it's on the agenda, you're working on it, you're talking about it at a meeting, it's not a preliminary draft at that point any longer, it's a public record. Next thing we'll talk about is personnel files. So this is personnel files for town employees. The only information that is exempt in a personnel file is information that would pose an invasion of personal privacy if it were to be released. And kind of like promptness, what does invasion of personal privacy mean? People have all different kinds of standards about what they consider to be private information. Some people don't share anything, and then other people, you go online and they've got every single day a picture of where they've been and what they're doing and where they are and all that. So there's a standard, though, that the courts came up with, and what it is information that is an invasion of personal privacy is any information that will be highly offensive if it were to be released, and information that does not pertain to a matter of public concern. So you're thinking about things like social security numbers, medical records, information about somebody's family or home life, things that could be in an employee personnel file that really don't pertain to the public's business. They don't pertain to that person's job. They just happen to be something that the town has a record of. What is not, something that's an invasion of personal privacy, and sometimes people get this conflated a little bit, is it's not just information that's embarrassing to us. If you work for the town and you got caught, 3 days in a row, just sitting at your desk going on Facebook and you got suspended for a day, you may not want people to know about that, but there's a public interest in knowing about, the conduct of our public employees. Are they doing a good job or not? How much are they being paid? Those are all public, public records. Communications of public employees on town time and what they're talking about related to their job duties. So, personnel records, it's not as big of an exemption as people think sometimes. They think, oh, it's my personnel file, it's off limits. It's really only if there's a privacy concern. If there is a privacy concern with personnel files, the law says you need to notify the employee, kind of like executive session where we talked about, that you would notify the employee being discussed. If you receive a request for an employee's personnel file, first you look at the request, you look at what the information is in the file, and again, if you think there's something in there that is a privacy concern, you go to the employee, and then they can object. If they object, you don't release the information. So that's preliminary drafts and notes, personnel files. And then another one comes up fairly frequently, attorney-client privilege. Again, this could be you're seeking a legal opinion from your town attorney, you need legal advice on some kind of issue. The most important thing with attorney-client privilege is that, it's kind of in the name there, you keep it confidential. If you, this happened actually at a meeting, if you start reading at a public meeting an email from your town attorney, it is no longer attorney-client privilege. So if you, if you're discussing in public session things that you got from your town attorney or things that you think are attorney-client privilege, once you waive the privilege, once you start discussing it openly, it's not protected by attorney-client privilege anymore. There's also an exemption in the law for records that would pose a security risk if they were to be released. This is kind of like the executive session. So if somebody wants, you're talking about the new security plan, if somebody wants a copy of the schematic that shows where all the cameras are located, you could say, no, I think that's a security risk. If you ever have an issue where you think there's a security risk, I'll give you a real life example. So this is a town, this is ongoing right now. There's a board of ethics, and somebody had a negative finding against them, and they were asking for all the information about the complaint that was filed and all that. And the board of ethics is concerned because the person is really interested in, they're after the identity of the person who filed the complaint. And they believe that this person, I guess, basically made it known, once I find out who it is, I'm going to do something to them. So they're concerned, rightly, right? They don't want to necessarily give out the name of the person who filed the complaint because now this person has said, I'm going to go after them. So if there's ever a security risk, whether it's, person's safety could be in jeopardy if you release the record, physical security, the building plans or security cameras. If there's anything there where you think there's a security risk involving those records, what the law says is that you should have the first selectman go to the state police, and they have a person there who deals specifically with this. They would look at what the records are, you would explain to them why you think there's a security risk, and then they would make a determination, and if they agree and they say, yes, there's a security risk, you don't need to release the record. And if the person wants to file a complaint with us and say, look, we didn't get the records that we're after, the state police would come and defend you at a hearing potentially, and they would say, look, we agree that there's a security risk if those records were to be released. A couple other exemptions that are somewhat common, and I'll save a couple minutes. Yes?
I'd just like to go back to the attorney-client privilege.
Sure.
How much information breaks that privilege? I mean, if someone says, well, the town attorney indicated to us that A should occur, does that mean it's been broken and therefore that letter with that advice now becomes public knowledge?
I think that wouldn't be enough. I think it would be more of if you started to really, well, the town attorney suggested that we do this and this and this, and he said that, more specific. I think if you say, look, we're going to take the advice of the town attorney on this one, and we're going to do this, I don't think that's enough. It would be more about, like in that case, it was funny because what the ruling was that the parts of the letter that were read needed to be disclosed, but they didn't have to disclose the whole thing. So it's really a matter of how much you. So I think in that case, if you want to, if you want to discuss it, you make some public indication. It would be better to say something like, okay, we're going to follow the advice of the town attorney, and we're doing this, or something, or on the recommendation of our town attorney, we're doing this. You don't want to start repeating what they said. Based on the advice of the town attorney, that isn't enough to waive the privilege. It would be waiving the privilege if you said, well, the town attorney told us this, this, and this, and this, and this, and then we're doing this. So I think the specifics of what you get into would matter.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify.
Sure.
Thank you.
And then the last one I'll mention, because it does come, this one comes up a little bit more frequently than some of the others, is trade secrets. So what a trade secret is you know, a third party. A lot of times, you know, the town could be a vendor, and this is a business that a business the town is doing business with. They may share proprietary pricing information. They may share proprietary information about products or services or something like that. It's information that they are sharing with the town only because the town is a customer. And it's not information that they share publicly, that they post on their website or anything like that. And it's just sort of this, the exemption was put in there because if you think about it, it's the type of information that normally would not be put out there public, so the companies are not put at a disadvantage just because their customer in this case happens to be a public, a public entity. With all the exemptions, the important thing to remember is that all these things are still public records. It's just the exemption in the law says that you don't need to disclose it. So it's still, it's still a public record. A memo from your town attorney is still a public record, but you're not required to disclose it under FOI because, there's an exemption in the law. And those are basically the bigger ones. Anyone have any questions though about anything in particular of if it is disclosable, if it's not disclosable, or details on any of the exemptions we talked about?
Attorney-client privilege. If you're the requester, you request information you were spoken about to the attorney. You're told that this individual spoke to the attorney about you, and you request that information. They don't have to give it to you, even though you were talked about.
If it was, even if it involved you, if it was protected by attorney-client privilege, you wouldn't need to.
Everything is protected.
Yeah, they wouldn't need to release it. So the key thing with attorney-client privilege is it needs to be, again, confidential is the key thing. It needs to be something they haven't shared publicly, and it needs to be, pertaining to some kind of legal matter. So, for example, like if let's say you're a town employee and you're suing the town, and the first selectman is emailing with the town attorney about how to handle it. If they keep that confidential and it's related to that specific legal issue, you wouldn't be entitled to those through FOI. What happens sometimes, though, and this is where things get a little tricky, is that people can also request documents through discovery in court or subpoenas and things like that. Nothing like that is part of FOI. So if you're ever on a board or commission or you work for the town and unfortunately you get a subpoena, just know that trumps FOI. We talked earlier about those laws and things that will supersede FOI. That would be one of them. So if you get a subpoena for records or something like that, as a part of an investigation, if there's a police investigation going on and you're asked for financial records, those are there's not a that's not an FOI request. It's treated treated differently. So, but even if you're the subject of the record, if it's attorney-client privilege, it's attorney-client privilege. FOI exemptions, anything like that. So I'm going to, we talked a little bit about, what to do. I just always like to share, before I go, kind of a little story about what not to do. You may get a kick out of it. So this goes to City of Hartford probably 10 or 15 years ago, and this goes to the whole point of, dealing with difficult requesters. I know there's nobody in the town of Plainfield at all that is difficult, that ever gives you a hard time, that ever won't shut up at public comment, that never comes in and asks for all kinds of records. I want to see this, that, and the other thing. But some towns have them. We have these people that are difficult. We see them come in and we go, oh my gosh, here he comes again. So in Hartford, they had somebody just like that. He was formerly on the city council, and then he had a blog and a public access TV show. So this guy, who the city really doesn't like, makes an FOI request for copies of some legal bills and the invoices that go along with them, which, as I think you would take away from tonight, they're public records, right? It's public expenditure of funds. Maybe some of the content of the bills, if it talked about particular legal issues, could be redacted, but they would need to get the bills redacted and how much they paid and the invoices. So he sends this FOI request, and the city attorney writes back to him and says, I have your FOI request, and I will coordinate our response. We will provide you such documentation that is available under the law. So that's the acknowledgement within the 4 days. They're doing good so far. Next thing he does, town attorney, is that he writes an email to a colleague, and he says to the colleague, Carl, so who lit a fire under this asshole? Can I shut him down, or can I make him define what projects he is referencing? The problem was he copied the requester on the email. So now the guy who doesn't like the city, who made a request for legal bills, which are public records, has an email from the city attorney calling him an asshole. So then he goes and takes the email, he posts it on his blog, it's in the Hartford Current, it's on the news, It's a black eye for the city. The mayor goes to the corporation council and says, you have to apologize, you can't do this, like, you can't say that, even if you think it, don't put it in an email, especially don't copy the guy on the email, like, so, so the apology from the city attorney reads to the guy, apparently you have little else to do other than to pester me in this office and other city departments. Recall that I do not work for you. This is a guy who lives in the city. I would hope that you wouldn't write to someone who lives in town asking you for records that you don't work for them. You know, we are public servants, but beyond the point. So recall that I do not work for you. The purpose of the FOIA statute is not to provide you a playground. Again, the guy takes the letter, he posts it on his blog again, another negative story. Meanwhile, they never fulfill the request because they're so fixated on how they don't like this guy. The guy files a complaint with our commission. He wins at the hearing. Hartford loses at the FOI commission. They have to give him the legal bills. They can't charge him because they got so fixated on who he was and calling him names and how much they didn't like him. And I share that story for a couple of reasons. One, your emails are public records. You know, don't put things in an email that you wouldn't want somebody to potentially read out loud. And two, you know, don't get fixated on the reasons behind somebody's request, even if it's the difficult person that you don't want to see, or you're looking at it and you're saying, oh my gosh, this is making a mountain more of work for me. You got to look at what the request is. If they're public records for you, they're public records for me, they're public records for you. Really, it's about the records that the person is requesting. It's not the motive behind it. You know, your job is to look at them. Are they exempt? Are they not exempt? If they're not exempt, the person's entitled to the records. So, thank you for the attention. I'll give you my phone number just before I go. You know, what I tell people is, you know, if you have a question and you're not sure, please call. You know, we are here to help. We're not just the bad guys who come in when something goes wrong. I'd rather talk to you, have a conversation, or have a conversation with your first selectman before something comes up, so we can try to give you our best advice. So my number is 860-566-5682. You know, call and I'll get back to you. If I don't know, I'll try to find the answer, or I'll tell you I don't know. We may not agree on everything, but I would rather us talk it out. You know, if you're unsure about what to do, then you kind of go flying blind, and then, oh my God, I was wrong, and then somebody files a complaint, and you know, you're having to make the trip up to Hartford. So again, thank you, everybody. If you have any questions, you want to talk a little bit afterwards, I'll stick around for a minute, and then I have some handouts up here that you guys can grab on your way out. So, thank you.
And again, if you didn't get that number, don't worry about it. I have it, so you can always just contact me and I can share that. Just so you know, we have used FOI to bounce things off of your questions, and they've been very helpful and supportive, so it's a great opportunity to learn some more here. Again, the handouts